Oh, good morning. Yes, it works. Good morning. Welcome to Finanspanelen. We said coming in here, it's easier to do these things 8 o'clock in the morning in May than in December or January when we also have these seminars. This seminar series, this is a joint production and cooperation between SNS and a small, tiny research institute called SIFR, Institute for Financial Research, when I work. My name is PEHR WISSÉN, and I teach a bit at the Stockholm School of Economics and arrange seminars and write papers and things at this research institute. And we have these meetings once a month or so, and we've been doing it for a long time. And one of the ideas with this seminar series is to have presentations by sort of world-leading experts in on different topics, but also to have an active participation with the people attending the seminar. So not only have one-way communication. So you're absolutely free. You're encouraged to ask questions or comments. It doesn't even have to be a question. You can sort of just say what you feel about whatever is being discussed. That is very much appreciated and encouraged. So today we will talk about Russia. How bad is the state of the Russian economy? Free translation. And we are very happy to have Anders Åslund here. We haven't met for a long time. You were quite active in the Swedish debate. You're still active now and then in writing newspapers writing articles for Swedish newspapers, but earlier you were very much active. You were a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics way back, and the first head, I think, of what is today SITE, Stockholm Institute for Transition Economics, and is now at the Atlantic Council in Washington and active in the debate. So he will start for 30 minutes a presentation of the state of the Russian economy, and we will have comments from ELSA HÅSTAD, who is at SIDA and specializing, among other things. You have more areas than just Russia, but one of your areas of special competence is Russia. So we are looking forward to that. Anders Åslund, please, the floor is yours.
Here, and what I would like to discuss with you today is the theme, what is the state of a Russian economy? Oh, I should have pressed this. Is that better? Thank you. And I put the title like that: Russia's economy, stagnant by stable. So the bad news is that there's no growth. The good news is that all the macroeconomic variables in terms of stability look much better than you would have expected. So I will discuss that. But the first picture of Russia today, I should have had it here. It's Putin on Victory Day on the Red Square on the 9th of May. His speech this year was brief, and it was characterized by backward-looking, nostalgic. It's about World War II, and it is presenting as Russia won the war. No unnecessary mentioning of allies. The only ally of standing that was there was the president of Kazakhstan. So what we are seeing is a lonely, isolated, backward-looking Russia. And normally, if that's your attitude, you are not going to be very successful. But let me start with the positive parts of it in terms of what has been accomplished. Putin's first 9 years, it was 7% growth a year. And therefore the Russian people think that this is a stunning success. What can be wrong with a leader who gives that growth for so long? But the issue was that he arrived at the late table. After the 1990s, Russia had done the market economic reforms. It was ready for growth. And since production officially had fallen by over 40%, there was a lot of free capacity. And at this time, the oil prices start to grow. So what we have seen in Russia has very much been an oil and credit boom. And now that is over. So Putin's last 7 years have been minimal growth, 1% growth a year. And the characteristic of a regime today is state and crony capitalism. You can see in the Panama Papers where there were apparently 100 Swedes, but there were 6,000 Russians in the Panama Papers. The reason is very clear. The Russian banks are abroad because what you have in Russia cannot be qualified as banks, but dubious state institutions that lose money in various ways, and you would prefer not to have serious money in non-serious banks. So therefore, I think it's laudable that the Russians keep the money in safer places than in the Russian state banks that now has 60% market share. And then, of course, the lower oil price since mid-2014. I'm not going to devote much to that, but normally oil prices are low for a decade and high for a decade in 25-year cycles or so. So the average for the last 100 years is that low oil prices have lasted for 11 years. We should expect them to stay low for a decade. How much is low? I would argue $30 to $50, not more than $50 per barrel, and exactly where nobody knows. And then financial sanctions since July 2014, which I think have been much more important than understood. So what does this look like? Let's see, I don't have any pointer here. And you see this looks going steady down, a big decline of almost 8% in 2009, and then a new decline of 3.7% last year. You know, when statistics are not doing well, you tend to revise them. So I think that we should trust Russia's statistics ever less, because they are now tending to revise them up. They did a revision of GDP by 10% last year. They have done something similar with wholesale trade this year. They have just increased the real wages by 3% statistically, not in reality. And therefore, I think that we should be more cautious than with Russian statistics as they were, because they used to be extremely good. You can still look up on the central bank website last week how large were the Russian reserves exactly and what did they consist of. So the Russian central bank has quite an outstanding transparency. The financial sanctions have been more effective than people realize. And of course, this is very much about the shooting down of the MH17 plane over occupied territory in eastern Ukraine. But the United States introduced the sanctions one day before, because they already saw the Russian operation underway that had gone beyond what was acceptable, while Europe needed the shooting down of a plane in order to get going. These sanctions are essentially in three parts. One is financial sanctions, one is defense cooperation sanctions, and one is development of new oil, that is tight oil, Arctic offshore, and deep sea drilling. These three forms, and that's important in the longer term but not in the short term. The financial sanctions are extremely important. To begin with, the Russians thought that so much for the Americans, now we go to the Chinese, until they realized that all the four big Chinese state banks have operations in the United States, and therefore they do not dare to violate American sanction regime. And that's what turned out to be the same with the banks in Singapore and Dubai. So in effect, the sanctions have been almost complete. the small holes that exist in, for example, Chinese Development Bank, which is a pure state bank that can actually give loans to Russia. And then there are the non-bank transactions that can be carried out. But what we are seeing today is that the US sanction regime rules the world. And this is the US Treasury. The US Treasury loves sanctions because without sanctions it has no role in national security. And you know you won't have a role in national security. So therefore the US Treasury is now a real hardliner and tightening the sanctions. How important is Europe in this? Politically, it's very important. The Obama administration has paid a lot of attention to get Europe online. It's Vice President Biden who sits and calls presidents and prime ministers who are hesitant around Europe and say, now you join and stay in the European sanctions. And that is quite a lot of pressure. But in terms of effectiveness of the financial sanctions, it's the US that does it. Any dollar passes through New York, and that means that it's subject to US jurisdiction. And US jurisdiction is very rough. So if you look upon how the sanctions function, all the sanctions now as one presidential executive order for Crimea, and then 3 for these sectoral sanctions on eastern Ukraine. That are issued by the president. No interference of the Congress. No legislation. And then what in effect happens is that OFAC, the office that deals with this in the US Treasury, writes the actual sanction law, which is not a law. It's just an executive order, a decree. Then they investigate possible crimes. They prosecute and they judge. And the judgment can be very severe, as BNP Paribas saw, that got almost $9 billion for violating sanction regimes. Something similar is underway now against Deutsche Bank. And this means that it's not only that you are taking a sanction risk, you have a reputational risk if you get involved in such business. What do you think of BNP Paribas and Deutsche Bank after this? At least less than before. And then, of course, there is a credit risk because all kinds of assets are declining in value. So what effectively is happening is that Russia is losing about $80 billion a year by paying off its foreign debt service as it comes due. So it means that the balance sheets look very good. But it also means that they can't get new financing for investment. And it's very much that the state companies, they have to pay off. The private companies are happy to pay off because they want to improve their balance sheets and they don't want the big currency risk. So therefore, these financial sanctions are quite effective. But what the Russians are doing in response to this is that they are letting the exchange rate float and fall with the oil price. And that leads to imports falling more than exports. So somewhat amazingly, Russia has actually improved its current account balance in the last year. So here you see just how big the movements are. So you see the oil price having gone down from over $100 and now down to where I did this was $37. And at the same time, the exchange rate goes up from used to be 33 to it has been up to 80. Now it's about 65. So that's fully compensated for. And this leads to persistent current account surpluses. This is even bigger because it's exports and imports. I have a put there. Where Russia has typically had a surplus of $200 billion a year. Now it's a bit less, because it looks like this. Russia's exports have fallen by 1/3, because oil and gas used to be 2/3 of exports. And if your oil price is about half, then you lose 1/3 of your exports. And the imports are then falling even more, by half. And this means that the current account adjustment for the Russian economy last year was 13% of GDP, which is massive. Effectively, this means a big blow to the standard of living in Russia, which I shall elaborate upon. And a broad expectation that also I thought, you have seen it all over, is that Russia will run out of the reserves. I can give you now a firm message that is not happening, and it's not likely to happen. Because the Russian government, or rather more specifically the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has decided that he wants to have $385 billion of reserves. Might sound slightly arbitrary to you. Sounds arbitrary to me, but it sounds reassuring. So this is what has happened. So the reserves right now are around $385 billion, as they were on the 1st of January last year. So Putin does not allow this to fall. If necessary, he lets the exchange rate fall more, so that there is a more surplus in the foreign balance. And to this comes a conservative fiscal policy. The current policy is that keep the budget deficit to about 3% of GDP. And given that Russia's public debt is 14%, this is not a concern. So if the oil price falls, then Russia revises its budget, and it can do so on a short notice, since it has no particular problem with the parliament, which is essentially a transmission belt for legislation that the Kremlin desires. It had been a long discussion now this spring whether Russia would revise its budget in May, but when the oil price came back, so they decided not to do so, and said we might do it in the fall. So all the discussion about the budget deficit becoming too large is also flawed, because this is something that they focus on and can swiftly adjust when necessary. So here you see what the budget situation looks like. In the early 2000s, Russia had budget surpluses all the time. And then it fell down. They made a massive stimulus of 10% of GDP in 2009. And then relatively fast they have come back to balance. You can say that this is not too different from the Swedish fiscal policy. This is pretty much what you should do. And now, 2005, 2006, we are somewhere around 3% of GDP, not going further. So in terms of fiscal policy, this is pretty ideal. Moving on to the monetary policy. Inflation shot up last year to 16% because of big devaluation of the ruble. But now it has come down to 7.3%, the latest reading, and it's likely to fall to 6% by the end of the year. The central bank keeps its policy rate at 11%, which means that you have commercial loans at close to 20%. So this is a very strict monetary policy, and you can see what is ignored. Economic growth and investment and stimulus. That is not considered important. And it looks like this. Inflation shot up 2015 inadvertently, and now it's going down again, and it will probably fall to 4% next year because that's the government or central bank policy, and they do what it takes in order to get it there. Unemployment stays low. It has now reached 6%, but for a long time it has lingered around 5.5%. So you can say this is essentially full employment. Regional looks quite different because Moscow and St. Petersburg have overemployment, and then you have serious regional unemployment. But on average that looks very good. So here I come to the conclusion, the positive conclusion of situation, and that is 5 important variables of stability in Russia. It's maintaining large international currency reserves, keep the budget deficit small, and the public debt also. With exchange rate falling with the oil price, there's a large foreign surplus, and unemployment must be kept low, and inflation is low. So for a fiscal and monetary conservative, this looks pretty good. And this is what you would expect conservative professions to do. So what you can see from this picture is that Russia has very good technocrats who are surviving. Liberals in the Ministry of Finance, in the central bank, and Ministry of Economy. But, of course, as you all realize, something has to give. So what has to give? You can say in short, the people. Real wages last year fell by 10%. Retail trade sales by 10%. Investment by 8.4%. GDP fell by 3.7%. The reason why it did not fall more is essentially because of net exports, which is not standard of living. So, and it continues to fall. Don't believe these forecasts on what will happen with Russian GDP. They tend to be wrong. So, as an example, December 2014, the IMF predicted a growth in Russia's GDP last year of 0.5%. It became 4.2% less, namely a fall of 3.7%. But this is quite standard. Currently, the forecasts have come down to about -2% growth for this year. My suspicion is that it will be approximately as last year. But something quite important is that Russia's GDP in dollar terms, because primarily of a big devaluation, has fallen from $2.1 trillion 2 years ago to currently $1.2 trillion. So when you hear businessmen complaining that the Russian market has fallen because of the Western sanctions, it's an incorrect statement most of the time. It's that the Russian market has fallen because of the falling oil price. That's say that this is at least 3/4 of the reality. So perhaps the sanctions take down Russian GDP by 1%. The rest is an effect of the much lower oil price. So where in the world have you seen similar economic policies? Any good idea? These are very uncommon economic policies. Nicolae Ceausescu in 1989, and it didn't end very well. So the big question that nobody can answer is how much can the population take? And here is what it looks like. You have, you see where you have a zero line up there where I have a legend. The real wages that are now going sharply up. This is a statistical adjustment, revision that I don't believe in. So I think that this is just a statistical joke. I think that the retail trade is more representative of what is happening, falling by only 6% a month now, month over month, year over year, rather than by 10%. But this is quite a terrible situation if you are an ordinary Russian. And on top of that, you have counter sanctions that the Russian agriculture minister Alexander Kachov, who happens to be a big businessman in farming, he doubled his land holding during his first year as Minister of Agriculture to 546,000 hectares of land. So this is the fifth biggest agriculture company in Russia. So, and if you have so much land and agricultural production, you don't want competition. So what do? You impose sanction on other countries' food. And this means that an ordinary grocery store in Russia now, not ordinary, but upscale grocery store is 2/3 empty, because 2/3 used to be, or almost all of it used to be imports, and very little can be replaced with domestic produce. You would not really like to dive into the Russian cheese industry. It's not too impressive. And now Western cheeses are prohibited for imports. So this is the crony aspect, that anybody is allowed to introduce protectionism, and if it hurts the population, they do not care. So what is the future outlook? Is there a new normal? What one would expect, simply because the adjustment last year was massive, is that there will be a slower output decline. I suggested that it would be as much. Most statistics forecast say about 2% now. Real wages and standard of living continue to fall more than output. There is reduced investment also in state corporations. And here is perhaps the most positive post. You saw last year that the very powerful head of Russian railroads, a KGB officer from St. Petersburg of Putin's age, Vladimir Yakunin, was sacked unceremoniously in August. In February, somewhat less powerful head of Ekonomi Bank, one of the three big state banks, was sacked. And clearly Putin has used Ekonomi Bank as his pocket bank and his slush fund. It has made extremely bizarre investments. For example, it spent $10 billion in loans to 2 useless Ukrainian steelworks. An enormous amount of money for no good purpose whatsoever. Industrial Union of Donbass and SIFR and that was done 2010 to 2015. But now they are cleaning up the books, and these very wasteful companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, are now not allowed to do most of their silly investments, which would have cost tens of billions of dollars. So there is this is quite a positive tightening, and it also means that we are now seeing 3 big private banks that are amalgamating private banks that are collapsing. Previously it was only the state banks. So there is some impeding of the expansion of a state sector. But on the less positive side is that the interest of the cronies is maintained. By the cronies, I mean essentially 3 people who are at the top. Gennady Timchenko, mainly in gas and oil trading. Arkady Rotenberg, who's a specialist on getting orders for pipelines and roads and not necessarily building them afterwards. and Yuri Kovalchuk, whose specialty is asset stripping from Gazprom, financial assets and media assets. And what happens in this crisis? Well, Putin gives Arkady Rotenberg Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, a multi-billion-dollar asset. And for no apparent reason, it's given to Rotenberg. And Rotenberg is the one who's building the bridge over the Strait of Kerch between Crimea and Russia at the Azov Sea. And the numbers, whether it will cost $5 or $10 billion, are unclear. But Rotenberg will certainly make a big profit on that. Of course, these are all non-competition deals that are made. So the interests of the cronies are well taken care of, and you wonder how much can be done. The Russian internet is full of all these sordid stories about what is happening, and that is a serious concern. So, and absolutely no reforms in sight. What Putin can do, he could withdraw from Donbass. That's what I could imagine, and then ease the financial sanctions. The oil price he can't do anything about, or not much. So, and the reforms are simply out of question. So the newspapers write from time to time about that now Putin has a new reform plan. Don't believe it until you get very strong reason, because it's the very essence of the system. So what can give? Yeah, as I said, the oil price is not likely to give up. Putin is not giving up on the kleptocracy, his cronies. And sanctions is the one that can change. And I think that the Russian behavior there depends very much on the oil price. Let me move slightly more broadly. How does Russia look in comparison with the two other big countries in the neighborhood? And you can see Poland moved up 92 to a high growth rate because they did all the reforms early on. It took Russia and Ukraine a decade before they got to a high growth rate. And then they got stuck in a rent-seeking mechanism. Ukraine, as you can see here, did much worse. This is what drawn-out hyperinflation does to you. Ukraine had no policy for 3 years. Russia had some policy, and therefore Russia did much better than Ukraine. But later on, the difference is not all that great. Ukraine is worse. And yeah, this is what the difference. And this is the last picture I wanted to show you, because this is my overall picture of the former Soviet bloc. You can see that this is 3 groups of countries. In the bottom, here you have really corrupt countries. And if you're really corrupt, you're corrupt for a purpose. It is because people at the top are making a lot of money. How can they continue doing that? By maintaining authoritarian rule. So this is authoritarian rule, this is Freedom House axis, and this is corruption, transparency, international. I will change the scales for it. So this is one stable equilibrium, where you have Russia and all the Central Asians, plus Belarus and Azerbaijan. In the other corner, you have democracy and control over corruption. These are all the countries that have joined the European Union. The European Union is quite outstanding at building rule of law and democracy to quite a number extent than we tend to realize most of the time. And if you see there, Romania and Bulgaria are not more corrupt today, according to Transparency International, than Italy or Greece. Not that these are outstanding rule of law countries, but still. This is a substantial improvement. And the most interesting countries are the four that are not in either of the equilibria. Ukraine, which is as corrupt as the post-Soviet countries in general, but quite democratic. Moldova and Georgia and Armenia are a bit less corrupt, but nor are they fully democratic. So I think that these are the critical players that one would like to see changing. And the question is, or would expect changing, is if they will go down, as Ukraine clearly was under Yanukovych, or if they will manage to come up to the EU group. And just to give you one picture from Putin's websites, he puts himself up in uniforms like this, and as Big Brzezinski comments on this, but Putin is not really serious. Hitler would not do such a thing. Mussolini did. He dressed up as a Roman emperor and so forth, and that's exactly what Putin likes. He loves dressing up in various suits. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. You know Anders, of course, very well. You don't know me that well. So I will give you a few words of introduction of myself. And I have a cold this morning, so please bear with me. My name is ELSA HÅSTAD, and I grew up in the Soviet Union. I did so because my mother worked as a foreign correspondent during the Brezhnev time. And then when I was a teenager, the Soviet Union fell apart. So the bad years, I was standing in lines queuing for food and also trying to exchange coupons that I had for sugar and butter. So I really expressed the crisis of the fall of the Soviet Union. And then my working life has been devoted to Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Eastern Europe. And today I work at SIDA as Assistant Director General, and the department I'm heading is Eastern Europe, Western Balkans and Latin America. So, Anders, I have 3 comments, and my comments are also ending up in questions to you. It is all about resetting our expectations. What do you think? So, I will start with the self-criticism part, and then I will move on to economy, and then the scenarios. And some of this, of course, Anders, you have already touched upon. But still, I would like to start talking about the self-criticism. As all of you might know, Sweden was deeply engaged in supporting Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. In different areas, Sweden was engaged in the justice reform, in social security reform, environment, in changing the energy policy from heavy subsidies to fees. Sweden was deeply engaged in the transition from communism to democracy, from planned economy to market economy. And we actually believed, so many of us, and I'm sure that you are here today, we believed that Russia would move into a much more democratic country. We had such high expectation, and those years were truly the good years, with a lot of hope. A little bit like when Mandela came into power. Those were the years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in Russia, we had a huge group of advisors, development partners, everyone was there, and investors. I'm sure many of you were there during those years. And you and me, Anders, we started, I think at the same time, maybe, I don't know exactly when you started, but it was all in the years of the 90s, and you were certainly one of the most famous advisors. So those years were the good years, with high expectations. Then came the sad years that we are in now. I am convinced that the international community did everything possible and everything that we could given our expectations. But sometimes I hear experts say that no, we actually did a lot of mistakes those years. And they include you in that, and they include us being the development partners in that. I do not fully agree, because I think that we did everything we could. But still, what could we have done differently? Could we have done things differently during those years? And did we have too high expectations on what would actually happen? Because we did expect democratic development. So that would be my first question to you, based on this comment. Moving on to my second comment and my second question, and that is about economy. Is Russia still a market economy? Well, we know that Russia needs to improve rule of law and reduce corruption, as you just told us, in order to attract foreign direct investment. And we know that reforms would have benefited Russia far beyond only foreign direct investments. We also know that corruption is the top problem in Russia today. We also know that the two most sensitive things to talk about is the governmental ownership that has increased. And then we also know that the number two most sensitive issue is the continued militarization, which is also very non-transparent. And the increased governmental ownership is also very non-transparent. We also know that there are 60,000 entrepreneurs in prison today in Russia. 60,000. This is according to diplomatic reports that I read just the other week. We also know that poverty has increased approximately 4 million people just these recent years as a result of the recent years of recession. And this is from a World Bank estimation that also concludes that 14.3% of the population is poor in monetary terms only. However, the good news, as also pointed out by you, Anders, is that there are skilled experts working in the financial state sector. We have the very good technocrats, as you point out. Budget is almost balanced. We also know that you wrote a book in 1995 called How Russia Became a Market Economy. So my second comment and my second question to you is, can we still call Russia a market economy, given the lack of new entrepreneurs rising, given the lack of security for entrepreneurs? Everyone knew what happened to Khodorkovsky. He was not a small entrepreneur, but still, given the strong state ownership. So, moving on to my third comment and my questions, and you touched upon this a little bit, but I would still like to sharpen them into 3 different scenarios, building on your slides. So I have 3 scenarios. One is the more conflict scenario, the second is the positive one, and the third is the Maidan scenario. So the more conflict scenario, well, as we know, every leader has to build a social contract with its population. And during the good years, the social contract between Putin and the population was that he delivers stability. Middle class was growing, stability, country, economy. He was sober, not drinking as Yeltsin. You know all that. But now, during the bad years, Putin cannot deliver the same kind of stability. So what can he deliver? He delivers muscles and he delivers powers. And as all of you know, following Russia, this has increased his popularity enormously. So he needs to continue these conflicts in the neighborhood, showing muscles, showing enormous power. So is that the future we can expect? A sort of more conflict-driven policy in order to stay popular. And as you know, in Russia, they say this is the power between the fridge and the TV, ideology versus food. So the second and more positive scenario is the re-engaging with the West. Why not? Europe and Russia has had a long history of being one, and that could all be rebuilt. Russia could fulfill the Minsk agreement. Russia could contribute to a peaceful solution in Ukraine. Removal of sanctions would follow on that. Reforming the justice sector, improving rule of law, attracting more entrepreneurs, encouraging investors, and a new generation of entrepreneurs. Sound very optimistic, but possible and realistic, not unrealistic. And then we have the third Maidan scenario. And Maidan, of course, is the reference to what happened in Ukraine. And what I mean here is people going out on the streets demonstrating for something that they want very much. Anders, as you just said, the photo you showed, Putin, this man cannot save Russia. So the third scenario would be the fall of Putin, perhaps. Because that would be based on that people are actually fed up with economic decline, the income loss of 9.5%, the decline in living standards. We know that people today in Russia, they consume less and they eat less. Life is getting much, much worse. So they are fed up and they mobilize themselves, as we could see in 2011. They simply walk out in the streets and protest. Then, of course, we do not know what would happen. But still, that would be my third scenario. Thank you.
Keep it up and I can...
If I can have the both of you.
Where do you want us?
Yeah.
Anders, you
I'm happy
have
to
to address the questions, I suppose, from ELSA, please.
Happy to do so. First, what could have been done differently? When you have a revolutionary change, you have a window of opportunity. Normally it doesn't last for a long time. And in Russia, I would say that the window of opportunity was from the 28th of October 91, when Yeltsin made his grand reform speech and asked for all Western support he could get, until the 1st of April 92, when Putin lost control over the Congress of People's Deputies, the parliament. So this was the window of opportunity. What had been needed? $25 billion of Western loans, which today sounds, after Iraq, sounds like a ridiculously small amount of money. But, and who could have given it? It could only have been done by the US. And George Bush was so proud of what he had accomplished with in Germany, reunification. So he thought that he was here enough from that. And thought that Russia is hopeless and bad in any case. And was not prepared to spend a lot of money because he thought that was unpopular, because he was perceived as a true foreign policy. So therefore that did not happen. Europe had no real role there because Europe had no voice. It was only the US that could have done it, and it was not prepared to do so. And more specifically, what went wrong in Russia? The first thing that went wrong was that a non-reformer became head of a central bank on the 22nd of November 91. And he thought that one should have a moderate expansion of the money supply, only 10% a month, which means close to hyperinflation, which is what happened. So the reformers never got control over the money supply, therefore it couldn't function. The second big thing that went wrong was that Gaidar did not manage to convince President Yeltsin to liberalize the energy prices on the 1st of January 92. Therefore, you could buy 1 ton of oil for $1 and sell it for $100. In this way, big fortunes were made. I would say that these were the two most important. And then the third is that the ruble zone persisted. And that meant that you had 15 central banks that were issuing ruble credits. And their view was that credit is not money. It's only cash that is money. So therefore we can issue credit. It has no negative effect on inflation. And of course it had massive negative effect on inflation. So you had competing issue of money. So and this competition was successfully won by Ukraine in 92. So Ukraine had a smaller decline in GDP in 92 than Russia because it took a larger share of the total GDP by issuing more money. So this was really a prisoner's dilemma. I would emphasize those as the three concrete issues that went wrong. And
is Russia still a market economy?
A good question. It's ever less so. We see more state enterprises, more monopolization of markets, more corporate trading. The number you mentioned here, 60,000, is too low. So Putin himself in December mentioned that there were 200,000 businessmen in pre-trial detention and in 2014, and 83% of them lost their enterprises. So it's a standard matter now that the so-called law enforcement agencies, investigative committee, the FSB, and the prosecutors, they arrest people because they have nice enterprises. And then they say, you can get out if we get the enterprise. And therefore, we see a massive capital flight from Russia because it's not a good place to invest in. And there's so much money being made in this fashion. And Putin himself is deeply involved in this, the whole top. So you can say that corruption in Russia in the early 90s looked like this. There was little corruption at the top. I don't think that Yeltsin was really corrupt, even if he didn't have a clear concept of it. But there was a lot of corruption down there. Now corruption looks like this. People lower down are not allowed to be corrupt, and therefore Russian administration functions surprisingly well. But at the top you have enormous corruption. So you have then lots of multi-billionaires. And there's also, a few years ago, there was a joke about it, that advice to a young Russian lady whom to marry. It's better to marry a high state official than an oligarch, because the money is the same and the tenure is so much more secure for a state official. Was there any more?
And yes, the scenarios going forward.
Yeah,
more conflicts, re-engagement with the West, or Maidan too?
I don't believe at all in re-engagement with the West. I think the system is simply so stuck, as I showed here, the corruption and dictatorship, and also that we are acting in the same way. So I think that what one should focus here is on the four countries that are lose bits. And of course, Ukraine is the big lose a bit today. I don't think that Putin will survive. This is a personalized regime. Putin has effectively destroyed all the institutions. Elsa and I have discussed how the law enforcement doesn't work. The justice has got much worse. And Putin has intentionally done away, for example, with the previously very good economic courts. Because they were good economic courts. He wanted to have political control over it. But institutional destruction is so severe that I think that the system will collapse when Putin loses power. So the question is how that will do. And you can discuss a society in three layers. Opposition, middle class, they're doing too well and they can leave freely. They are leaving in large numbers. Most of my friends are leaving Russia. They won't do it. And also the repression is so efficient that I don't think that will happen. People lower down, Moscow and St. Petersburg, too much control. It's the big provincial industrial cities. So think of Poland 1980. It was in Gdansk, Szczecin and Gdynia and Katowice, and not in Warsaw or Krakow that it happened, and it had to happen very spontaneously, otherwise it could not happen. And then you would expect something to happen at the top level. We are seeing very funny things, intrigues going on now at the top level between FSB, the old KGB, and Putin's new National Guard, and Kadyrov with his private army. So I would expect pressures from below leading to a top-level fight, or otherwise unsustainable regimes, as we saw in the Soviet Union, can last for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So the time is very difficult to predict.
Okay. While I wait for just one follow-up before I... if you were, both of you, to give advice to the West, whatever the West may be, the US and Europe, I suppose, sort of how they should treat the situation. Sort of, would you recommend more sanctions, less sanctions, sort of how to deal with Russia in the international community, so to speak?
Not more sanctions. I do not believe in that. I think that we need to continue to be engaged with Russia, talking from Europe but also Swedish point of view. And we should not allow Putin to win when he says that the West is against us. And, it's a very... it's an atmosphere of everyone is against us, the US and the Europe, and I do not think that we should fall into that trap. So no, I think continuous engagement, but in that engagement we should be firm and stand up for the values that are shared in Europe and
so we should not be
West.
Provoked by the sort of more or less open threats that have been going on for.
No, I think we should stand firm, and we should have a good self-confidence in who we are, and we should not sort of fall into this trap of being an enemy, because we are not an enemy, and that is a construction created by Putin and Russia, and he made millions of people believe that the West and the US actually is an enemy, and I think we should resist falling into that.
Okay, Anders?
Sanctions have a very clear aim. They are against Russian aggression in Donbass. They should be withdrawn when Russia withdraws from Donbass.
Okay.
And
but until that time,
in the Crimea, you have a personal sanction. So I think that sanctions should have a very clearly defined target, and then be done away with. Broad sanctions
but stay as they are for the moment.
Yeah,
so.
And but something that should be done is transparency. I think that this Panama Papers now is just a beginning. The offshore world will open up. It's with modern technology, it's impossible to keep it a secret. And what we are seeing now is this big criminal apparatus of the Kremlin, and I think it's quite important to have it opened up. And we saw yesterday that David Cameron called for the 100,000 expensive buildings in Britain that are owned by foreign companies, but this is being revealed. So I think transparency. That's what we should operate. And of course, if crimes are being revealed, then they should be prosecuted where they belong.
Thank you. Please.
Can Russia continue its military build-up even if the economy kind of down? Can Russia continue and increase its military build-up, or doesn't it have any effect the economic situation?
The answer is clear: no. The Russian military expenditure is 4.2% of GDP, which is today about $50 billion, and compare that with U.S. military expenditure of $650 billion or so a year. There's no comparison. And I think in Donbass, Russia has essentially used old ammunition to predominantly a little bit of new arms. The Syria war probably cost $500 million. So these are relatively cheap operations. And Russia cannot go ahead for this big Eastern cosmodrome that we have built in the Far East cost something like $6 billion and seems to have been an enormous mess and waste. But what we can say about Putin's military operations is that they look very rational. I think Elsa mentioned it, or I put it in different terms. Putin needs more victorious wars in order to keep himself popular. He hasn't so much bread any longer, so now he needs more circus. Circus means war. So if you look up on Putin, 1999, war in Chechnya, 2003, war against the oligarchs, admittedly not a real war, 2008, war in Georgia. The big mistake was that he didn't make a war in 2011, 2012. They forgot domestic protests. He won't repeat that mistake. 2014, Crimea. And then I think a big mistake was they did in Donbass because it was not a small. It was not a small and it was not a victorious war. I think it was a big misjudgment that they thought that the ethnic Russians in Ukraine would stand up for Russia. On the contrary, they stood up for Ukraine to an unexpected degree. And then I think that the Syrian war was highly rational, quick in and out, and so many gains for Russia. So what is reassuring here is that Putin is a risk taker, but he's rational. He's not mad. So he can't convince us that he's mad after Syria.
Okay, Elsa, then
short comment. He's a war child. Putin is a war child, so he's not interested in a big-scale war. And as you know, a lot of Russians say, as long as there is no war. So, but I think that he is prepared to pay quite a lot for these small-scale conflicts to be able to show power and stay in power.
The administration seems, as you point out, to be quite tough on the local business people in Russia and the entrepreneurs. But how do you view their attitude towards non-domestic investors in Russia? I mean, we have a lot of Nordic companies active in Russia. Do you see that they will be treated differently?
Quite a mixed picture, actually, that big Western companies, if you take Total, for example, are given an extraordinary red carpet treatment. But when you have, for example, Kinnevik's TV2, that did not get a G4 license when all the others got it. So sooner or later you tend to get squeezed out. While you can buy the forces of the system, while you can get a lot of advantage from the top of the system. And previously, if you take smaller enterprises, were often protected by sensible mayors. The mayors have much less power now, so they can't protect in the same way. Previously, people could go to the economic court, where foreign companies normally won. The economic courts have been merged into the ordinary court system, which is much more politicized.
Please.
Thank you. How do you see the future relationship with China? You haven't mentioned China so much, Europe and US, but China is now an important player in the game, especially the gas deal that is seemingly on hold.
So the big event was the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping on the 30th of May 2014. And after that, two things happened. The oil price collapsed, and therefore the gas plans between Russia and China will not take place for the foreseeable future, perhaps sometime, but with another price situation. And the US sanctions made China stop financing for Russia. So Russia is highly suspicious of China. And I heard many years ago, the former first deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Russia said that we have refused to become a junior partner to Russia, so therefore we have become or to the United States, so therefore we have become a junior partner to China. So the Russians feel that the Chinese are getting the better of them. And this is also with Putin in the last 2 years. Before, Putin was the big boaster of China, which is not so broadly popular. But the Chinese are now allowed to buy natural resources, which has happened in the last year or so, which was not possible before. So you could have American companies buying natural resources in Russia, while the Chinese were not allowed. So this shows how deep the suspicion is. China has been very careful to be neutral between Russia and Ukraine. So Ukraine is the second biggest arms exporter to China, and the biggest corn exporter to China. China has supported Ukraine in all IMF votes, which are not publicized, while Russia has abstained in those votes. So there's very little solidarity between Russia and China.
Please.
Yes, just two quick questions. I mean, first, do you have any guess or idea who might succeed Putin the day who are the candidates, so to say? And secondly, why did he step down in 2008 and allow Medvedev to come in for a 2-year period, for an 8-year period? Was there a 1-year period, sorry, a 4-year period? Was there a specific reason? I mean, I guess his democratic pretensions are not very big, so was there a particular reason for that?
I think in 2008 that he thought that he could retire. My suspicion then was that he wanted to become chairman of the Constitutional Court so that he could guarantee his own immunity. And then late in the day he realized that was not enough. So then he decided to become prime minister. And then he realized that that was a boring slog, that it was much better to be president. So then he decided to come back. I don't think that it was ordained in that fashion. And your first question? I mean, the top person after him is Sergei Ivanov, who speaks excellent Swedish since he's been resident in Finland. But he's also one of the parties in the strife in the Kremlin today as a chief of staff. So he's the strongest, but that would be against Putin rather than for Putin. The most popular politician in the Kremlin after Putin is Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. While Prime Minister Medvedev has high popularity ratings, say 3/4 of Putin's normally, he's nobody. Or
No, that is, I just would like to add, we were listening to a person who's been very close to Kremlin, and what he says is that Putin is very effective in creating conflicts among all his closest men surrounding him. So even if we have this top 2 or top 3, who knows what will actually happen the day Putin steps aside, because there are so many conflicts among them. So they might just intrigue each other out of the political life, and then we could see new faces coming up.
Okay. Could I please ask you to present yourself before you...
My name is Stefan Zetterfeldt from Handelsbanken. I have just a short question. Will the Crimea, will it ever become Ukrainian again?
I think it will be like the Baltics. Nobody will ever recognize that it is a Russian property. And the sanctions that in particular the European Union has imposed on Crimea are very severe. So, which are sanctions against individuals. If I remember rightly, something like 150 people in the enterprises. So this will stick. And of course, Crimea is was poorly developed. It's been to Crimea, I guess, every year for 8 years or so before it was occupied, and it's down market. It's a cheap tourism at high prices. Very dirty and poorly maintained. So it's a big mess. And now, of course, people are leaving. What is typically happening now, I see many people in Kiev, young people who say that their parents are still in Crimea. They want to make a career, so therefore they move out. So I think it will be not depopulated, not at all as in Donbass, but a sharply reduced population. And of course, transportation is very poor, and it took them now months to get electricity. And the Ukrainians are really tightening the screws on Crimea, so they are feeling the strength in relation to the Russians, since the Russians have cut off most trade with Ukraine, so therefore Ukraine is not so sensitive to Russia any longer.
Could I take the last? No, I can't. Please, you can.
My name is Karin Grundberg. I'm a reporter at the Swedish business daily Dagens Industri. Recently, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs directed a threat towards Sweden a little bit regarding a possible, if Sweden would enter NATO, become a member of NATO. How did you react when you read the interview, and what conclusions do you draw?
Well, that was exactly what I expected, and Putin's Russia is very fond of threats. So this is what you're supposed to do if you're a Russian diplomat, throw your weight around and be as obnoxious as possible. So I would not read anything particular into it. It just shows that Russia is not very friendly, or I should say that the Putin's regime is not very friendly to anybody. As we could see that they only could get Nazarbayev coming to his big victory parade on the 9th of May. And of course this is an additional incentive for Sweden to join NATO. Lavrov should not be considered an independent player. He's just an outstanding diplomat who does exactly what he's supposed to do.
Could I ask a last question then, because we're soon out of time? I very much liked your diagram, the complicated one with the two islands and things. I mean, because it showed what the EU has achieved, and one would wish so that more people could appreciate what that achievement is and what it was worth. And I think, among many others, thought that large parts of Eastern Europe was heading in that direction, sort of more transparency, less corruption, more of a market economy, and sort of in a, say, 10-year horizon or so. Could one hope for such a development in the Ukraine and sort of some of the troubled parts, and what sort of role could Europe play in such a development? I realize it's not a short question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I can answer quite briefly. The big thing that Europe did to these countries to begin with was open their markets. These countries had by 1994 2/3 of their exports to the European Union. And that has not happened to Ukraine. Ukraine and Moldova suffer badly from EU protectionism, partly because the vast majority of their products are sensitive, agriculture and steel, with regard to Ukraine. So if the EU increases its 36 quotas for Ukraine, that could be of enormous importance.
Right.
And then you have the Copenhagen criteria, which are few and effective on a market economy and democracy and rule of law. And after that you have the accession process, which is a tedious 10-year-long process where you get all the laws right and you get the mechanism right. So this process is supposed to have started with Ukraine, but the EU is much less effective in Ukraine than it has been in Eastern Europe. I've not dug into why that has happened.
So it's at least a 10-year project too.
Or if things go really well, Ukraine could apply for membership in 2020 and join in 2030.
Okay.
That would be a success.
Elsa, you will have the last word.
No, very, very short. The group of countries that you could see in the middle, they're also part of the Eastern Partnership, and actually also includes Belarus, but they sort of tend more to gang up with Central Asia. So, and the fantastic with that group is that EU has decided that yes, let's open up our market and visa liberalization, and that is a driving force for these countries. So they are actually in a group aiming for European Union and, as you say, Anders, the accession process. It will take time, but they are already a defined group, so they have decided, which is very important.
Okay. Slightly optimistic perspective. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Elsa, so much.
Thank you.